started. I'm going to forego the mic for the introduction, but I promise you Steve will use it during the presentation. My name is John Clark. I'm the Vice President of Branford Land Trust, and on behalf of the Land Trust, I'd like to welcome you all and thank you all for coming out on yet another cold and frigid night here in Connecticut. So welcome. It's my pleasure and privilege to be able to introduce Professor Steve Broker to you this evening. I get the honor because Steve and I are old friends, going back to our days teaching high school in New Haven. Steve is a very extremely highly regarded, distinguished science teacher in the New Haven public schools for some 23 years, divided by a break, which I'll touch on. Steve holds degrees, a couple degrees from Wesleyan University, and also a degree from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. In addition to his science teaching in New Haven, Steve has worked as the associate director of the graduate program of liberal studies at Wesleyan University. He was also a program director for the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. He's also been very active in the Yale, I forget the exact name of it these days, the Yale Teacher Institute, which over a number of years has worked very closely with New Haven educators and has worked, I guess, nationally as well on teacher preparation courses. And of course, Steve's focus is science. Number of years ago, Steve developed a passion for ornithology, and particularly for the Peregrine Falcons, and more recently, I guess, for ravens as well, particularly those that nest in the greater New Haven area. Let's see what I'm getting. Steve is currently an adjunct professor at Connecticut University. He's also done other university teaching, University of New Haven, as well as through the Yale Teacher Institute. He is the secretary of the Connecticut Ornithological Association and past president of the New Haven Bird Club. He served as the statewide compiler of the Connecticut Christmas bird count for 25 years and writes a yearly review, an article on the annual bird count for the State Journal of Ornithology. His field studies focus not just on breeding peregrine falcons and common ravens at West Rock, but he also spends considerable time studying marsh birds on the outer Cape Cod, and he participates in recent and past breeding bird atlases in Massachusetts and Connecticut. He and his wife Linda, who is here with us tonight, reside in Cheshire, Connecticut. So if I left anything out, just add it, Steve, and with that I can introduce Steve Broker.
Thank you, John, very much. And I want to thank Martha Rice as well and Meg Kilgore for inviting me to speak before the Branford Land Trust. Let me mention that in looking at the website for Branford Land Trust, and I'm a resident of Cheshire, but I can certainly relate with land trusts throughout the state of Connecticut. The missions, as I think you know, of the Branford Land Trust are to preserve open space in Branford through acquiring and managing land, and to promote the community's appreciation through education of Branford's diverse natural features, their natural resources. This is a laudable goal. It's an extremely important goal for an organization in any town in Connecticut or throughout the country. And I'm very pleased to be speaking to the Branford Land Trust, particularly about an issue that involves conservation. You will find in this talk that there's a full range of human emotions that connect with the peregrine falcon. This is a species of bird that has a lengthy history interacting with humankind. In the United States and elsewhere in the world, it has elicited feelings of joy and awe, curiosity, but it also, because of its unusual history, elicits feeling of anger and sorrow and disgust with the way in which humankind has treated this species. So I think we'll have some of those various elements come out in the discussion today. The focus then is peregrine falcon in the state of Connecticut. And I hope to accomplish three broad topics that relate to peregrines. First, I'd like to say something about the historical records of peregrine falcon breeding in the state of Connecticut. This is a period of time prior to World War II, basically. I'd like to refer, in part at least, to why it is that the peregrine falcon went extinct as a breeding species east of the Rocky Mountains by the mid-1960s. That's the part of the story that elicits anger. And give you some of the causes for the decline of peregrines eliminated as a breeding species in a large part of the United States. I'd then like to focus on the 16 years of research that I've put in, field observations that I've put in, on one pair of peregrine falcons that are breeding in the state of Connecticut. And I'll make some reference to another pair of peregrines, also in the greater New Haven area, where I have put in some observation time on their breeding activities. And then finally, I'll give a brief summary of the status of territorial and breeding peregrine falcons in Connecticut today. This is a story that starts out very sadly, but it ends in a very positive note. So you're going to need to work with me through the sad parts of the story in anticipation of the wonderful conservation successes that occurred with this species, not just in Connecticut, but throughout the United States and elsewhere. So I think we're queued up with our PowerPoint presentation. Is it possible to have lights drop down a little bit? Let me put in that request. And I'd like to give you some, there are two things that I need to mention to you prior to launching into the story of peregrines. They are the reasons why I began studying peregrine falcons in 1999. My research study site for the last 33 years has been West Rock Ridge State Park, which is one of the largest state parks in the state of Connecticut. It encompasses portions of 4 towns, New Haven, Hamden, Woodbridge, and Bethany, and it is in effect an island in a sea of development. This is a concept of island biogeography. You don't need to be just an island in order to be isolated reproductively from surrounding areas. Trap Rock Ridges in the state of Connecticut serve fundamentally as islands in a sea of development, at least in part. So West Rock Ridge is a trap rock ridge which runs north-south through the state for about 7 miles. It is the lowest, the most southerly of trap rock ridges in the Connecticut Valley lowlands, in addition to East Rock, very well known as a birding spot, and the intermediate Pine Rock and Mill Rock areas of New Haven. You know that further north is Sleeping Giant State Park. Mount Carmel is the historic name of Sleeping Giant. And further north we have Chauncey Peak and the hanging hills of Meriden, Mount Higbee, Lamentation Mountain, the Barn Door Hills, Talcott Mountain, right up to Massachusetts, where there's a continuation of these trap rock ridges through the state of Massachusetts and the Central Valley lowlands. So if we look at the map very briefly, here's West Rock, New Haven and Hamden, Woodbridge and Bethany, this 7-mile-long north-south trending ridge. This is a ridge that has been studied very extensively for more than 100 years by a variety of individuals, university-associated and not. The Yale School of Forestry, George Nichols did some of his well-known studies of Connecticut habitats using West Rock Ridge, as an example of the types of communities and environments that exist on a trap rock ridge in the state. More recently, insect studies, entomological studies have been done by Charles Remington from Yale University. Some of Charles' students have done PhD theses on West Rock Ridge, including Larry Gall, who did a study of Catocala underwing moths on the ridge. Noble Proctor from Southern Connecticut State University, who is a resident of Branford, has done studies on West Rock for a period of 40 or 45 or 50 years. And I'm fortunate in having been introduced to West Rock to pick up on some of the activities that enrich our knowledge, I think, of natural history. I'll also mention that West Rock has the second highest concentration of rare and endangered plants in the state of Connecticut. This is a view of West Rock from the west. I'm actually in a canoe on Knowles Pond off Route 69, the Litchfield Turnpike, photographing West Rock Ridge. And you'll notice the scar in the landscape, which is quite evident in the center of this picture. That is an abandoned quarry. Just as Sleeping Giant had part of the head chopped off during the quarrying period, 1930s and earlier, there was an active quarry at West Rock Ridge. And although I don't know a lot about it, I believe the community decided this is not a good way to damage this landmark. Let's cut off any quarrying that takes place. But this quarry site remains very prominently at West Rock. And interestingly, this is where Peregrine falcons have come in and settled. This is what the cliff looks like from on top. I have the good fortune of being able to have easy access to the top of West Rock Ridge because I'm on the state advisory board for this state park, as well as being an active member of the West Rock Ridge Park Association. So whereas for a number of years I used to walk to the top, I must confess that I now drive to the top. It saves me a lot of time in terms of pursuing my various studies. I've mentioned that this is a very diverse set of ecosystems. Here is a vernal pool, one of at least 5 different vernal pools that exist on the top of West Rock Ridge. You know that vernal pools are these spring ephemeral pools that fill with water with melting snow and spring rains. By the end of hot summers, they are all dried up. But they have a series of organisms that live in these vernal pools. The poster child is the spotted salamander. Marbled salamanders also live here, and wood frogs, and a variety of other very interesting vertebrate and invertebrate organisms. So I study vernal pools, and here is a photograph of that vernal pool during February or March, where you see a mass of wood frog eggs just covering the surface. This is a communal egg-laying area, which is characteristic for wood frogs in vernal pools. So you can study amphibians very successfully here. You can also study reptiles successfully here. There's a tremendous diversity of different biological diversity of species of snakes that are found at West Rock Ridge, turtles as well. We don't have the state endangered lizard, the 5-lined skink, so far as anyone knows, but there is great diversity here. You may recognize this as northern copperhead. I photograph these and make note of their occurrence. I do not handle them. They're one of the 2 species of poisonous snakes that are found in the state. They're generally very docile. And this is also a wonderful area to study a diversity of birds. Here is the island, which is in the middle of Knowles Pond. About 5 years ago, the first 2 nests of great blue heron were constructed on this island in the treetops. This rookery has now expanded through last year to 10 different great blue heron nests. And these birds are going to be coming back very shortly and reconstructing their nests and setting up shop for another successful reproductive season. There's one other species, as John mentioned, that I study extensively at West Rock Ridge, and that is the common raven. What I found is that those who tend to study peregrine falcons invariably wind up studying ravens because they have similar breeding habitat. So this is a fledged bird from 2013, and this is a photograph taken 3 days ago, this past Sunday, looking straight down 40 feet into the raven nest, which has been rebuilt since January 20th. 6 eggs are now in that nest being incubated. So you can see I've got some work ahead of me in following this raven nest. The second thing that I should mention prior to focusing specifically on peregrine falcons, John alluded to in his introduction, and that is that I've been very active with bird counts in the state of Connecticut. I started doing the New Haven Christmas bird count in 1983. I've done every count since then. And I started doing the summer bird count, which began in 1991, introduced to New Haven Bird Club by my friend Steve Mayo. And I've done every summer bird count since then. Very briefly, a Christmas count involves 24 hours out in the field where you and your associates do the best you can in locating bird species, counting them, and publishing the results. The summer bird count, which has a much younger history, the Christmas bird count was first started in 1900 and is the longest continuously running biological census in the world. The summer bird count makes use of the same basic guidelines as the Christmas bird count, although not so much supervised by National Audubon Society. This is a staged photograph. It certainly doesn't look like this winter, does it? It's actually a sparrow's workshop from a couple of years ago, and folks are staring in lots of different directions here. But let me mention that both the Christmas and the summer bird counts involve a 15-mile diameter circle, which has a specific published center. There are 18 such counts in the state of Connecticut. One of them is the New Haven Christmas bird count. The center is the center of the New Haven green. So you go in 7.5 miles in all directions from New Haven green, and it encompasses something like 8 different towns. Now we get to peregrine falcons. Because on January 10th, 1999, I was participating in the New Haven summer bird count. I was on the top of West Rock Ridge. I had missed the Saturday of these 2 days. I missed Saturday because I was out of state. So I had to be pretty active on Sunday in order to track down birds. And at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, on June 10th of that year, on the top of West Rock Ridge, all of a sudden a bird shot over my head like that. And I realized that that was a peregrine falcon. I said to myself, I've got a good bird for this count. Federal endangered species, state endangered species, only breeding in one location in the state of Connecticut. I scrambled back to the top of the ridge to get a better view. A moment later, shooting over my head, peregrine falcon, and a moment after that, a second peregrine falcon. And that's when I realized I had something really special, a potential breeding pair of peregrine falcons. Here's the results of, this is how we publish the results of either Christmas bird counts or summer bird counts. The summer count is coordinated statewide by Joe Zaransky of Greenwich and Patrick Cummins of Meriden. And here's what raced over my head, a peregrine falcon. So let's consider, first of all, what this species is, and then we'll start looking at some of the historical information that relates to peregrines in the state of Connecticut. Now, it's fully appropriate, since we're here at Blackstone Memorial Library, to make reference to David Sibley and the Sibley Guide to Birds. because David is going to be here on March 12th, releasing the second edition of the greatest field guide to birds that has ever been produced, the Sibley Guide to Birds. David grew up in Guilford, Connecticut. I was fortunate enough to bird with him when he was a youngster, and with my mentor in birding, Tony Bledsoe. And if you want a good field guide, there are many good ones, but this is the best, it seems to me. So let's take a look at Peregrine Falcons for a moment. Not the clearest image here, but we have both western and eastern versions of the Peregrine Falcon. There are 19 different subspecies to this species of bird. I mentioned that the eastern subspecies went extinct because of DDT poisoning and persecution. And if you look at the lower left, the lower right here, what you can see is a juvenile bird and an adult. They have very pointed wings. The wings fold close to the tip of the tail. The juvenile is very brown, and it has vertical striping or splotching on the underside, vertical. So brown and vertical striping. The fully adult bird has horizontal bars and ultimately turns a beautiful slate blue-gray. There are 3 areas of exposed skin which are helpful in deciding how old one of these birds is. On the mature birds, you get a brilliant yellow color on the legs and feet, also on the cere, which is at the base of the bill, and also the featherless eye rings on the bird. So the richer the yellow, the more mature the bird, and the stronger the slate blue-gray colors in general, the more mature the bird. Here is a photograph of an immature Peregrine falcon. You can see the brown effect, and on the underside, the vertical striping on this bird. And here's a photograph of one of the West Rock Peregrine falcons. You can see the barring, which is horizontal, the typical shape of a Peregrine falcon with pointed falcon-like wings, and the yellow on this bird. Take a look at the feet. You'll notice that there are some bands that are on the feet of this bird. It has been handled by humans. It has been banded for tracking purposes. Here is a photograph that a friend of mine, Matt O'Lear, sent me of Peregrine falcons that have fledged from the nest, but they're perched on a bridge in the Maryland area. So they're kind of intermediate in appearance. They look young. They look young and immature, don't they? And they look hungry too. And notice that the one on the left is bowing to the one on the right. Keep in mind that these birds are predatory birds. They are spectacularly evolved killers. Keep that in mind. And basically they're saying to each other, I'm okay, you're okay. So let's stay on the same shelf together. Okay, if this skips out, I may need to. There we go. Okay, another photograph from Matt O'Lear. What a handsome bird. What an incredibly handsome bird this is. Now, it reminds me of making the following point. A peregrine falcon is looking at you like this, with the fovea in the back of its eye. But peregrines have 2 fovea. So a peregrine falcon is looking at you directly like this also. Now that one's looking straight on. But if you see a photograph of a peregrine that's looking kind of off to the side, it's looking at you, and it sees you. All right, now, in order to talk about the history of peregrines breeding in the state of Connecticut, what I'd like to do is dive into some of the historical literature on this species. And I'm going to ask you to bear with me as I do some citations from some of the key reference material that relates to the history of peregrine falcons from the mid-1800s to just before and during World War II. The other thing I should mention is that as it relates to the West Rock birds, this pair of peregrines was the second or third pair of peregrines to begin nesting in the state of Connecticut post-DDT era. DDT, a biocide, probably has saved more human lives than any other chemical that's been created by humans. It kills mosquitoes, it gets rid of malaria in many parts of the world. On the other hand, it bioaccumulates in the food chain. So the higher order consumers that are eating birds that eat plants, for example, are getting this chemical concentrated in their bodies. And the result of this with eagles, peregrine falcons, osprey, pelicans, other higher order birds, is that when they lay eggs, the eggshell has not been deposited as well as it would under ordinary chemical-free conditions. So the bird will sit on the egg to incubate it and break the egg. And this is fundamentally why peregrines were driven to local extinction, the widespread use of DDT. The other thing to mention about the West Rock peregrines is that the first pair that occurred at West Rock laid the first egg by a peregrine falcon pair in 50 to 60 years through the state of Connecticut. And that was an extraordinary event because I was on top of the ridge in anticipation of egg laying beginning shortly. The female, when she's in the nest, will tend to go into a stupor for 3 or 4 days. She just stands there, seemingly doing nothing. And I went over to West Rock Ridge in the year 2000, got to the ridge at 2:30 in the afternoon. It started to rain. The wind was blowing at about 30 miles an hour. I set up my spotting scope on the ledge where these birds were preparing to nest. And all of a sudden, the female started raising her tail and dropping it slowly. Raising her tail and dropping it slowly. Now, I make my field notes in a handheld recorder, and I'm shouting over the wind into the recorder, saying, "My God, is she about to lay an egg?" I'm looking through my spotting scope, and at 2:45 in the afternoon, I saw a blood-red egg drop out of her body into the scrape. Now, that's something that nobody gets to see, but fortunately, I was there at the right time, and I saw the first egg come out of her body in 50 years on a cliff in the state of Connecticut. Those two events rewrote my life for the past 15 years, and I now spend somewhere between 100 and 150 days out of the year on West Rock Ridge observing these birds and also the ravens. So here's what Sibley says about peregrine falcons. This sleek, powerful falcon has long been considered the embodiment of speed and power. Found in open areas, it hunts mainly medium-sized birds from high above in spectacular stoops. Those stoops were believed to be about 180 miles an hour. More recently, someone has trained a peregrine falcon to jump out of an airplane and free fall down, and the top speed recorded for peregrine falcons in a stoop is 240 miles an hour. Think about that. These birds can move quickly. Now, this is illegible, so I'm going to read you a short section of it. We're going to look very briefly at the 4 checklists that have been done for the birds of Connecticut. The first one was done by Reverend James Lindsley in 1843. It was published posthumously. He died earlier in 1843. Incidentally, Lindsley is buried in Grove Street Cemetery and has a wonderful obelisk gravestone in Grove Street in New Haven. Here's what he writes. This celebrated and powerful bird was wounded by a gunshot in Stratford, Connecticut, and after he was taken, soon recovered and was kept on poultry until he became too expensive to the owner, and he released him. Although I was disappointed in not obtaining him from my cabinet, my collection, which means sacrifice the bird, being the owner forgotten at the moment of his release, why'd I let this bird go? It's my bird. Yet I had previous opportunity to examine him and was certain of its being the true Peregrinus or duck hawk. Duck hawk is an earlier, more common name for peregrine falcon. So that's the first checklist of birds of the state of Connecticut. Here's the second checklist. It came out in 1877. C. Hart Merriam, a very well-known biologist of the day. And here's what Merriam writes about the peregrine falcon. In the Hartford Times of June 29, 1861, Dr. William Wood of East Windsor Hill, Connecticut, published the first account of the first duckhawk's nest found in New England. Actually, it's the first found south of Labrador. It was discovered by Dr. Moses, Dr. S.S. Moses, on Talcott Mountain near Hartford, Connecticut, May 25th, 1861, and contained 4 young, almost large enough to fly. The finding of this nest was, at the time, of particular interest, since, as Dr. Wood remarked, it settled beyond dispute 3 points. First, that peregrines breed on cliffs. Second, that they breed in Connecticut. And third, that they nest very early, sometime in March. What are we in now? February? Getting closer. The third checklist to come out is the well-known, to birders anyway, checklist by Sage, Bishop, and Bliss, which was published through the State Natural History Survey in 1913. And here's what Sage, Bishop, and Bliss write about the peregrine falcon. A rare but probably regular fall migrant, a very rare summer resident. There's some information on nesting of this species in the 1913 account. Breeding at Talcott Mountain, 1861, 1863, 1872. 3 eggs taken by P.H. Woodford. Second location in the state, Mount Carmel, sleeping giant. May 9th, 1888. 3 eggs collected by Webb and Searles. Those eggs are now in the collection of one of the authors of this publication, Bishop. May 9th, 1899. 2 eggs taken by Bernard in the collection of Lewis Bennett Bishop. Spring 1910. 1 pair and an empty nest. You're beginning to get a sense of what's happening with these peregrines. The fourth and most recent checklist of birds of Connecticut came out in 1990 by Joe Zaransky of Greenwich and Tom Baptist of Waterbury, Connecticut. Yes, that's right. Tom just moved to Waterbury, Connecticut. Connecticut birds. And here's what these authors write. Status: a rare coastal migrant from late March to early May and from September to early November. It is occasionally uncommon on peak migration days in late September and early October. Non-breeding individuals occasionally wander into the state in summer. Now this is a book that came out in 1990. There was no nesting of peregrine falcons in Connecticut in 1990. The last known nesting was in the 1940s. And I think it's worth reading a little bit more from Zaransky and Baptist about what happened with these birds. The exportation of this large falcon was dramatic. Bagg and Elliott wrote a book about birds in the Central Valley in Massachusetts and elsewhere. Chronicled the persecution of this species by collectors at several sites in Massachusetts and Connecticut, in which hundreds of eggs and dozens of specimens were collected. They stated that in 1935, only 1 pair in Massachusetts successfully raised a complete brood. I believe that was at Mount Tom. The devastation was so severe that several eyries, that's an area where eagles or peregrines nest, were guarded by concerned citizens to protect nesting birds from the collectors' guns. The Talcott Mountain site was deserted in 1942 because of the shooting of both adults and game by a game warden. The last nesting in Connecticut was in the late 1940s when for several years a pair nested on the Travelers Insurance Building in Hartford. That's Zaransky and Baptist. So I began my research into the history of peregrines breeding in the state of Connecticut, and the single most important resource for me has been this book by Derek Ratcliffe, published in England, called The Peregrine Falcon. Ratcliffe is the individual who determined that it was thin eggshells, the result of DDT contamination, that prevented these birds from laying eggs with thick shells. So they were broken and breeding throughout many portions of the world came to a halt. I should also mention that there is reference in 1961 to a book by Locke Mackenzie, a relative, a writer, a resident of Guilford, Connecticut, who indicated that there was some evidence of peregrines nesting in Guilford. I have not been able to confirm that, so I don't accept it at this point, but that would have been in the late 1800s. So here's a summary of the historical breeding of peregrine falcon in Connecticut. 5 sites total for this species, and they are Talcott Mountain, Mount Carmel, Sleeping Giant, the Hanging Hills of Meriden, Craig's Castle, Hubbard's Park in Meriden, popular park today, Ragged Mountain. In the literature, this nest site is described as west of Hart's Pond. That's in the Berlin-Kensington area. And finally, Traveler's Tower in downtown Hartford, Connecticut. And I give you some of the dates of information that's recorded that is in the literature for when these birds were known to be breeding. Now there's one more reference that will be illegible for you, but it's worth reading because this sets the stage for fully understanding what's going on with these peregrine falcons. Then we'll jump to West Rock Bridge and the more modern day. You will recall that a Dr. William Wood from East Windsor Hill, Connecticut, received a pair of peregrine falcon young that were knocked off a cliff at Talcott Mountain in Avon. And here's what William Wood writes in the Hartford Daily Times, repeated in the Hartford Weekly Times in 1861. He asserts that a pair of peregrine falcons has nested for years on an inaccessible cliff on Talcott Mountain, some 10 miles west of Hartford, Connecticut. This I knew from the fact that these birds frequented this ledge during the spring, summer, and fall months, and had also seen an adult and young that were shot there in June. Monday, June 10th, 1861, I had the satisfaction of seeing 4 young and the adult female bird that had been taken from the above-named cliffs. My friend, S.S. Moses, who will never be outdone in anything he undertakes and who will compass sea and land to get a rare specimen, has succeeded in procuring this family. The 4 young are alive, hardy, and docile. From him I learned the following facts. Determined if possible to obtain the eggs or young of this bird, he made arrangements with some persons near the base of the mountain, Talcott Mountain, to closely and carefully watch these birds so that their nest might be found. And this goes on to describe the process by which over a 2-hour period, climbers went up to this nest at Talcott Mountain and with a long pole knocked 4 young out of the nest where they dropped down to the bottom of Talcott Mountain. They survived the fall. They were collected. 2 of them were sacrificed. 2 of the young birds were kept alive for a year by William Wood. And then the literature indicates that he gave these live birds to Spencer Baird, who in the 1860s was the director of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, the U.S. National Museum. Baird received these birds and kept them alive for another year, and then sacrificed them and put them in the collection at the Smithsonian. When I read this, I realized that I needed to go to Washington, D.C. and see if I could track down the specimen or the 2 specimens of peregrine falcons from 1861 from the state of Connecticut. So I went down in the year 2000, and I met the curator of birds for the spectacular ornithology collection at the Smithsonian. His name is James Bond. And I said, you know, I'm interested in locating the Peregrine falcon that was recovered in 1861 from Talcott Mountain in Connecticut. His response was, if you had been here a month earlier, we could not have shown you that specimen because we didn't know where it was. But we have just taken down an exhibit that went in, a public exhibit that went in 1950 called Man and Birds. In that exhibit, there was a specimen of a peregrine falcon dressed in falconry outfit with the hood and the gestles and so forth. We took it out of the case, turned it around, and realized it was the bird from Talcott Mountain. So it's not stored here at the Smithsonian, it's stored at our big storage facility nearby in Maryland. So the next day, James Bond and I and a third person named Patrick Doherty, who is a well-known sculptor using tree saplings for his sculptures, worldwide exhibitions of his various sculptures. The three of us went to the off-site building in Maryland, and I was able to see and photograph the 1861 Peregrine falcon from Talcott Mountain. The other one that was became a museum specimen was given to a museum in Chicago, not the Field Museum. I've not yet tracked that down. This is the subspecies that's extinct, Falco peregrinus anatum, the eastern duckhawk or eastern peregrine falcon. Now, let's spend a little bit of time talking about my observations at West Rock Ridge State Park. This is the view that you get from the top of the ridge. You can see a portion of Knoll's Pond. Route 69 is just beyond the pond. And this beautiful West River Valley that is found on the west side of West Rock Ridge. So a nice spring view of the ridge. This is the view that you get from what I refer to as the center column when you look straight down. This is a drop of 300 feet. So obviously you want to be careful when you're on top of the ridge. You cannot afford a misstep here, because there's no coming back. You'll notice that there are a series of vehicles down at the bottom. This used to be a landscaping operation, executive landscaping. It is now owned and operated, it's not part of the state park, but it adjoins the state park, and it's operated by a construction company. And here's what the ridge looks like on the west side. Now, these trap rock ridges are the counterparts to the Palisades along the Hudson River. They were formed geologically about the same period of time, roughly 200 million years ago. So this is trap rock, basalt, or West Rock diorite, a very hard rock that is used in construction, hence the quarrying that took place there. And the big quarrying operation these days is Tilcon. Perhaps you know where some of the Tilcon sites are. This is a view taken from a canoe looking at the quarry site. So this is the area that I spend a great deal of time at. And if we look at different parts of the quarry face, all of this is quarried out. You'll notice an overhang here and an overhang here. And below this overhang, streaks of white. That's whitewash, bird poop. Here is a chute that comes down, the result of the quarrying operation from 80 years ago. It's like a water slide. So if I were going to put Disney World here, I'd use that for the water slide. There's a ledge at the base of that, 100 feet down from the top. That's the nest ledge for peregrine falcons. Here's a close-up showing the whitewashed area. I refer to that as the birch perch. I have names for dozens of sites on this ridge for my notes. It's a gray birch, or black birch that grows straight out from the cliff, and it's the favored perch site of peregrine falcons, both the male and the female, so it's the birch perch. And a little bit below it and to the right is the scrape ledge where nesting takes place. There's the birch perch. When I go over to the ridge, I get up my binoculars, I walk down the south end of the quarry. First thing I look at is this site here. Is there a bird perched there or not? If it's not, I look at the north ledge, the north end of the quarry. That's another favorite perch site. If the bird's not there, I look at the trees that are on the talus slope below the quarry. That's another favorite perch site. And here's a view from the center column looking down. This is the 300-foot drop. And you can see closer to the dome of rock, the birch perch area, and a somewhat more severe angle is where these birds nest. And here is one of the peregrines at West Rock perched on the north ledge, a favored perch site for all of the birds that have been there. It's not just one pair of birds that have been at West Rock for the last 16 years. There are multiple males and multiple females sequentially present at the ridge over this period of time. So let's talk a little bit about some of the behaviors that I've observed here at West Rock. Territoriality. Peregrine falcons are highly territorial birds. They will not tolerate any other peregrine showing up in their space. If a floater bird, unpaired, flies into the quarry or along the ridge, that bird will be chased away very aggressively. I've seen that a number of times with these floater peregrines as the population increases throughout the east, being chased away from the quarry. In addition, every other predatory bird that you can think of that might be present during the daytime at West Rock Ridge is the enemy, and it will be chased away. This includes red-tailed hawks, the most despised bird on the planet from a peregrine's point of view, red-shouldered hawk, osprey, apologies, John, for that, but they don't like osprey, although they tolerate them to an extent. It includes turkey vultures, which are the most pestersome birds on a ridge, because they're always gliding up and down the ridge, and black vultures, which have come into the state since the mid to late 1980s. And also American kestrel, which is in the same genus, falco, as the peregrine falcon. That's a food supply for peregrines. A peregrine will eat a kestrel, happily. It includes Cooper's hawk. So a number of different species of birds, if they enter the territory of peregrine falcons, are going to get chased away. The ravens are nesting within 40 yards of these peregrine falcons. The ravens have learned that when they go through the quarry, they go over the top. So they're not in sight. And then they go back to their cliff nest. And then they come up and they go around again over the road that's on top of West Rock Ridge, generally to avoid confrontations. But there's a lot of interaction between those two species. So territoriality is a major aspect of peregrine life. Preening. In my notes, I find that one of the most common activities that these birds are doing is taking care of their feathers. Here's a bird that is preening its tail feather, or preening under the wing. They preen over the wing, they preen under the wing, they draw the feathers through the bill in order to realign the barbs on the feathers. This is a very common activity, and it could go on for about an hour straight. So I've got a lot of notes on preening for these birds. They use perch sites, and they hunt for food basically in two ways. It is almost always the male, known as a tiercel, who gathers the food for the female or for the young. Interestingly, the female that's present at West Rock for the last 11 years, I'll tell you a little bit about her, she hunts too. She's the only female I've seen hunting in concert with the male at West Rock. But primarily it's the male who brings in the food, brings home the bacon. And he will either hunt from a perched position, such as you see here, or soaring around up in the sky, fairly high, looking for prey items. They eat almost 100% birds. I would say about 90% of the diet is pigeons, rock pigeons. But I've also seen them eat mourning doves. They like mourning doves. I've seen them eat northern flicker woodpeckers. They love flickers. You can find flicker heads at West Rock. Fascinating. In fact, we used to collect them. Sorry, dear. The flashiest sort of prey item that they've brought in was a Baltimore oriole. Imagine a peregrine falcon capturing a Baltimore oriole with those spectacular colors and ripping it apart, defeathering the bird, getting into the body cavity, and consuming it. The other thing that should be mentioned about foraging is that the male will feed himself first. The female's off on the side for 30 or 40 or 50 minutes, yelling at the male, "I want food." He just continues to eat. And when he's done, then he will take the food item to the female and either deliver it directly to her or pass it off to her in the air in a process known as a food pass. That's fascinating to see. That is amazing to see. So foraging. Courtship. I think each of us at one time or another perhaps has seen birds mating, copulating. Because of the time that I've put in with peregrine falcons, I've seen them mating more than 150 times. So I know a lot about peregrine sex. And I can tell you that the average length of time for mating of peregrines is about 9 seconds. I won't pursue that any further. But the male will land on the female, and he takes his killer talons and curls them around like this. So he's standing on the back of the female with the soft part of his lethal feet. Female twists the tail to the side. Peregrine falcons have cloacas, as do all birds. They touch cloacas for a period of time, and then the male flies off. And they will continue to mate multiple times through the day, prior to egg laying, of course, and also through the entire egg laying process. Some feel that this is a way of maintaining a pair bond between male and female. Scrape preparation. Here is the ledge on which peregrine falcons at West Rock have nested most commonly. It is about 5 or 6 feet wide and maybe 3 or 3.5 feet deep. So it's a ledge with some sloping to it. Peregrines do not construct a stick nest or a twig nest. They will lay their eggs in a salad bowl depression that they make in the surface of, in the substrate on which they are nesting. It takes about a month to do it. You and I could make that same salad bowl depression in about 2 minutes, but they spend a month on it. And the way in which they do it is that either the male or the female will walk into the selected sites. That's under the control of the female, the final decision as to where to lay eggs. They will walk forward, squat down, and then kick soil backwards, and then sit down again, maybe shaping the salad bowl depression, and then stand up and kick again. And that takes a long period of time. They're also removing stones with the bill, moving them off to the side. Scrape preparation. Egg laying. I've only seen an egg laid once out of the body of the bird. That was extraordinary. But I have precise records on every egg that's been laid at West Rock Ridge over the course of the last 15 previous years. The earliest nesting, March 29th, 2000. Most of the time these birds are beginning their egg-laying process around the 4th or 7th or 10th of April. And the standard procedure for peregrines is first egg day 1, second egg day 3, third egg day 5 or 6 or 7, fourth egg day 8, 9, or 10. So it's a week to a week and a half for all the eggs being laid. Sometimes laid at night, sometimes laid during the daytime. Both birds will incubate the eggs. The female is the only gender that will incubate overnight. But the male will incubate for periods as long as 2 hours straight, while the female is off grooming herself or feeding, perhaps, or just chilling out. Incubation, 29 to 31 days that is required for these eggs to hatch. And when they hatch, this is perhaps the most vulnerable time for the species. Unfortunately, because they are early breeders, they get hit with severe weather when these eggs are about to hatch. So this would be in May, late April, May. And I can tell you that on at least 3 different occasions, I have seen an egg in which the young bird was in the process of breaking out of the shell when it died from hypothermia. That's where the bad luck comes in on the West Rock peregrines, because they get weather hitting them directly from the west, snow and rain, coming down on their nest site. The conditions sometimes are very cold, and the birds will not always survive during the hatching process. Feeding young, done primarily by the female. The male will deliver some food, the female will mince it up, feed the young birds in the nest. Fledging and survivorship. At West Rock, unfortunately, the survivorship has been quite poor over the years. I attribute this not to human interference. I am there after all, but I'm monitoring the way in which these birds relate to me or with others who are there with me. I think it's primarily due to severe weather coming in at the wrong time. We had for example, 2 or 3 years ago, we had a New Haven Bird Club banquet. The day of the banquet, there were 2 eggs that were getting ready to hatch. The day, that evening, we had a snowstorm. I went over the next day, or a rainstorm, I guess it was. I went over the next day to West Rock. One of the birds that was in the process of hatching was dead. The second one, unfortunately, did hatch and fledged. What happens when a nestling dies? The male, the tiercel, will eat it. It's a way of getting food back into the body of the bird, even though it's the bird's offspring. Don't waste any food. And finally, site fidelity. If there's a pair of peregrine falcons that is successfully breeding at a site, they are non-migratory. They will stay at that site and not migrate. All right, now just a little bit specifically on the West Rock ravens, peregrines, sorry, different talk. The West Rock peregrines. Where have they come from? Well, the majority of these birds carry color bands. The first female was black over red, metal band on the leg, left leg, 2 on its side over a 9. I read that fairly early on in 1999 with the help of Jim Zip, one of our spectacular photographers who for at least 3 years spent a great deal of time with me over at West Rock Bridge. I reported this to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Here's a bird in Woodbridge, 2 over 9. Where was it banded? The response, well, the bander hasn't reported banding this bird. That's a no-no in the banding community. So I was out of luck in 1999. In the year 2000, I read the other band, which has minute numbers along its length, 1807-63313. Over a period of about a week, I was able to read those minute numbers. I went back to the feds and said, here's the other band number. You assigned it. Where's this bird from? Well, you want to get in touch with New York State, because this band was distributed to the Department of Conservation in New York City. And I contacted the bander there and learned that that first female, the one whose egg I saw late in 2000, was hatched out on Riverside Church in Manhattan. and was banded by Chris Nadareski, who's the climber, on June 4th, 1998. In 99, this bird was 1 year old and incapable of breeding at West Rock. But the next year she grew up, and that's when she laid her first egg. The tragedy of that is that the day after this bird laid an egg, Jim Zipp was observing these birds, and he noticed that a red-shouldered hawk flew into the quarry. The female jumped off the egg, flew after the red-shouldered hawk, and was never seen again. That was crushing, to say the least, for the birds and for us. And we quit birding for about 2 weeks. We just couldn't. I was searching along the Wilbercross Parkway looking for a bird that had been hit by a car. We don't know what happened. One theory is that the red-shouldered hawk killed the peregrine. Another theory proposed by David Sibley's father, Fred Sibley, is that the bird was egg-bound with the second egg, couldn't get it out of the body, and perished as a result of that. Okay, well, let me bring this to a close with a brief overview of where the other birds have come from. 2 of the West Rock birds have come from 55 Water Street in Lower Manhattan. I mentioned the bird that hatched out on Riverside Church. Her father, incidentally, was named Henry Hudson, and her mother was known as Henrietta Hudson. These birds have come from Springfield, Massachusetts. They've come from Providence, Rhode Island, from the Superman building, the Fleet Bank building in downtown Providence. The female, who is present at West Rock now, in her 11th year, was hatched out in 2003 on the Providence-Worcester Railroad Bridge crossing the Connecticut River in Middletown, Connecticut. Banded in the nest by Julie Victoria, or the state of Connecticut, showed up the next year at West Rock Ridge. And she has been an egg-producing factory ever since. 3 or 4 or 5 eggs laid every year since that time. She's had 3 different males. And again, I'm not going to get into those issues from a human point of view. But the current male is 54 over R, black over green, and he is from 55 Water Street in Manhattan and was banded by Chris Nadareski, the climber for the state of New York. Another bird has shown up from Rattlesnake Mountain, Rubney, New Hampshire. So they're coming from a lot of different areas. It's tough being a bird. It's tough staying alive. And there are transitions. There are replacements that take place. The last thing I'll mention is that one of the partners of the Middletown female, as I refer to her, was B over Y, black over green. He was displaced from West Rock Ridge by a more aggressive male, 54 over R. And he disappeared in 2008. In 2010, he showed up at East Rock Park, paired with a female there from Jersey City, New Jersey. That female has left, and the new female is from Margate, New Jersey, outside Atlantic City. So you can see we can track these birds with these color bands and learn a lot about them. Finally, success at West Rock has been limited. There are only 4 years where these birds have fledged successfully. Last year was one of them when 2 birds fledged successfully. And one of the earlier fledglings is a female who showed up in the Susquehanna River area in Pennsylvania and has been breeding successfully for the last 5 years in Pennsylvania. I think I'll stop there, and I'm more than happy to take any questions that you might have.
Is egg pounding common in birds, in other birds?
I think it's common in poultry. I don't know much about raising chickens, but I'm told that it's common in poultry. And Fred Sibley, who was the collections manager at the Yale Peabody Museum for a number of years, is the one who proposed that the original female at West Rock may have been egg-bound. It's just a theory. We'll never know what happened. Yes?
First of all, thank you very much for this talk, because it's fascinating. We are always birding there, watching from down below.
I know, I'm looking down.
And you're looking down at us.
Here, look
But,
up the ridge.
So are they ever banded? Is there a group who's banding for you or with you?
Let me race through a couple
And
of
that's
shots.
very dangerous, I'm sure.
Yes, it is. Let me just advance a little bit further. Here's Julie Victoria on the right. She retired from DEP in 2011, I believe. And on the left is Jeff Kruger, who's the climber who does the banding of eagles in Connecticut and also Peregrine Falcons. In 2007, there was a nestling at West Rock Ridge, and Jeff went down the cliff with ropes, 100 feet, to the nest ledge. He took the young chick, known as an IS, put it in a duffel bag on a long rope. I hauled up the rope, delivered the duffel bag to Julie Victoria. She opened it up, did some measurements on the young chick, took a blood sample, banded it, put it back in the duffel bag. We dropped it down to the ledge again, and Jeff returned the bird to the nest ledge. I can tell you that the adults went ballistic when we were doing this, and it completely destroyed my relationship with the female for about a month. It took a while to get over it. I mean, otherwise these birds know me, they recognize me. I'm part of the landscape with them. But there have been 2 years when banding has taken place. Unfortunately, I think the state is stepping back from the banding process as peregrines become a little bit more abundant in the state. We now have 17 different territories, 17 different territorial pairs of peregrine falcons in Connecticut. And just a couple of years ago, they were downgraded from an endangered species in Connecticut to a threatened species. In other words, we're reaching a tip-over point where this species is successfully returning to the state of Connecticut. And the success rate in 2013 is that of 17 different pairs, it is known that 14 peregrines fledged throughout the state, with 8 additional nests not having been properly checked to see if more birds were coming from those nests. So it's a very dramatically different situation from what it used to be. And yes, it's very dangerous going down that cliff.
Now, when Julie writes down what she banded, you have the bands of both parents, it seems like. Is she recording that also?
I'm getting it from her.
Okay.
She has the information. I'm the volunteer.
Okay.
So
But
I
I mean,
will.
that's being recorded though.
I will write to her as a volunteer in the state and say, we have a bird, K on its side, over 1 on its side, black over green, showed up in 2004. And she will write back and say, I banded that bird in Middletown.
Okay.
So that's where it is now.
Now she knows the lineage.
Right, and Michael Amaral from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service based in Boston, also recently retired. He's banded 2 of these birds, Rumney, New Hampshire, I think, and also Springfield, Mass. So, yes, it's a wonderful way to keep track of the birds.
Is there a trend, do the young tend to stay around the area, take off, or is there any sort of...
The young, the question is, will the young stay in the area or disperse? And the answer is they will disperse. They have to disperse. The parents will not tolerate their presence beyond about August or early September in the vicinity. So these birds must disperse, grow up a little bit, and perhaps find their own nest sites.
There's been no stragglers, they tend to go way away, or just stay within the state, or...
Well, I think the best way I can measure that is to cite the locations of the West Rock birds where they came from, and it's Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York, and Connecticut. So I think the dispersal is somewhat limited. That's probably the best answer I can give to that. Yes, sir.
Is there any active teaching behavior in terms of learning to hunt for the young from the parents, or is that instinctive?
Is there teaching behavior or learning that takes place with parents and young? I would say yes, there is. These birds have various innate capabilities. When they reach a certain age, they'll start exercising and flapping their wings. That's certainly true of ravens. It's true of other species of birds. I believe they also accompany their adults, their parents, on flights in the vicinity. But this is where my data are somewhat limited, because by the time these birds are getting ready to fledge, I'm thinking about the beach at Cape Cod. So I relocate, and part of this latter stage of growing up and fledging and then dispersing, I have very little information on. Yes, Tom, please.
Two questions. Have you ever seen a peregrine and a raven go at it and injure each other? And the second question, Rachel across the Silent Spring, is there any thing you'd like to comment on that one?
Thank you. First question is, have I seen peregrines and ravens going at it and injuring each other? In spite of the fact that common ravens learn to stay away at least a little bit from peregrine falcons, there are constant interactions between the two species. And the interesting thing, Tom, about these birds is that the peregrines are very possessive of the quarry space, and they will drive any raven in the quarry down into the trees, where the peregrines cannot get at them. But in front of the raven nest, the ravens are defensive, and they will do the best they can to push away the peregrines. It's not necessarily an even fight, but both birds are going to be very concerned about the success of their breeding efforts. Your second question had to do with Rachel Carson and Silent Spring, and would I like to make any comments about that? Classic book, one of the great books dealing with conservation issues and environmental issues in the United States. Rachel Carson was trashed by the chemical industry and by, in part, the scientific community. But she won out in the end. She is regarded as one of the great figures in the American conservation movement. And there is no doubt that her contributions from writing Silent Spring, which I think came out in 1962, were directly responsible for the, in part at least, for the writing of the Federal Endangered Species Act, and in 1972, the banning of the sale of DDT in the United States. Now, we continue to sell it to other countries, but it can't be sold in the U.S. anymore. Now, that was 42 years ago, and I think we're still feeling the effects of DDT. Every one of us in the room has DDT in our bodies. We know that from studies that have been done. But Rachel Carson's efforts were key to our turning the corner on the widespread and unthinking use of biocides in our environments. The problem is not solved by any means, but in some respects we're better off, particularly as it applies to DDT and some of the other carcinogenic or bioaccumulating chemicals that we produce. Yes?
Two questions here too. One is, are there any natural predators that are issues, weasels, rats, things like that on these at the nest site? The other thing is, question is something or other that I just forgot.
Well, I'll take that.
I know what it was. It was, excuse me, if it's okay to do.
Yeah.
It was, you said the doves and the flickers and the, what was one of the species?
Baltimore Oriole,
Yes.
various others.
Yeah. Are these birds taken at perch in general, or are they taken in flight in general?
I appreciate your asking that. It should have been part of this talk earlier on. The first question has to do with mammalian predators on peregrine falcons. Yes, skunks and raccoons and rats and various other mammalian predators are a potential threat to peregrine falcons. As a result of that, peregrines will nest in largely inaccessible cliff faces. I've described this location at West Rock Ridge. It's 100 feet down, and no mammal is going to get there, except for a bat. So they are very cautious in where they breed. Now, the peregrine falcon also is a tundra breeding bird, and there are many known nest sites on the ground for peregrines. And I'm not directly familiar with those situations, but I would imagine they have to be both very vigilant in protecting the nest, and also that there's a certain amount of loss from whatever mammals, kit foxes or Arctic foxes or other species that might be in the environment. And then the second question had to do with how the hunting takes place. Peregrines will capture on the wing. What they will do is fly out from the cliff. From this 300-foot cliff, they've got a wonderful panoramic view of the West River Valley. They'll spot a bird, and they will go up and come at it at an angle. So it's flapping flight away from the ridge. And then all of a sudden, the bird will start tucking in the wings and going into a stoop, and at a rate of more than 100 miles an hour, will be aiming at its prey item. And it's got two choices. One is to grab it in its talons, if it is a smaller bird, and then bring it back to the perch site, or the nest ledge, and consume it. Often what you will see is feathers flying from the recently caught bird. I've seen this only about half a dozen times, an actual capture. They will also bite the neck and maybe cut the head off before they return to the nest site, not always. The second way in which they can kill is by hitting the prey item with the chest. They do that as well. It's a specially reinforced skeletal structure, and it can knock the wind out of the prey item. That would take place, I think, in part with larger prey. I've on several occasions seen, during the wintertime, seen peregrines take out ring-necked ducks on Knoll's Pond, flying over the ice. And they will, if they miss the first time, they'll come back if the duck is confused, and nail it and take it right down to the ice and feed on it there. So it's exciting. Yes, sir.
Instead of making a comment and also a real quick question, observations have been up in Acadia National Park, and I know they get a lot of visitors that go there, and I go in June and they have nesting pairs there as well, so a lot of travelers, it's a good opportunity to see them as well. My question is, in regard to DDT, and there's a lot of talk about how it all played out with Silent Spring Book and the start of the environmental movement, which is great. It's fantastic that these 5 or 6 species of birds, perhaps more, were basically saved, But what doesn't get talked about a lot is when it was banned in this country, I guess a lot of other countries in the world, it effectively was banned there too. And there's estimates of 10 to 20 to 30 million children perhaps died because there wasn't a replacement, a safe replacement for DDT. So that doesn't get talked about very often. This is a good opportunity for you to, because you're an expert in this.
Well,
And how
I
that-
know.
Well, I just often wonder, this is a question, I'm a supporter of environmental movement, of course I wouldn't be here, but was it worth it to save these handful of these fantastic birds, from extinction in lieu of there being millions of children dead?
Yes, well, I did make some positive comments about DDT being probably the human created chemical that has saved more human lives than any other synthetically created chemical. There's no disputing that. The question is, what sort of a price do you want to pay for this? There are other ways in which one can fight malaria by using mist nets. I think Bill Gates has been involved with his foundation in providing mist nets in third world countries, for example. There are other strategies that can be used in order to fight disease-carrying mosquitoes and other invertebrate organisms. I think the answer is clear. We are not doing this to bring back peregrine falcons or bald eagles or osprey or pelicans. We are doing this because the chemicals are getting in our bodies as well, and there's no positive aspect to that. So I think the move in '72 to stop selling this chemical in the United States was the appropriate one to make. I think that has paid off in terms of an improved environment, both aquatic and terrestrial environments, here and wherever else the chemical has been banned. And there are other ways in which we can more sensibly fight human disease than by using a chemical which is properly called a biocide. DDT is a life killer. It is not a life preserver. It's a biocide. So let's figure out other ways, as the chemical industry has shown we can, to deal with this problem. And I hope that, at least in part, answers the question. Yes, please.
Explain how the population has expanded back into this area. Was it from domesticated falconry and stuff, or was it more from the west? And the second question is, you talked about all the growth in the predatory birds. How much of a population can we support before we start to really see an impact on the lesser birds?
Right. So two questions. The second one is how much can these populations grow before perhaps they reach a carrying capacity, correct?
Yes.
And then the first question, just to repeat it for me quickly, if you would.
I don't think you touched on how the species moved back eastward.
Yes.
Whether it
Okay.
was from the west or from
Right.
introduction from falconry also? Or?
Let's start with the Travelers Tower in downtown Hartford. And I stayed away from this part of the story because it's available in a number of publications, and it didn't have immediate bearing on the observations that I've been making at West Rock and also at East Rock. The first peregrine to occur at downtown Hartford Travelers Building was named Amelia. She was hatched out, she was an egg, she was in the egg stage from an area in Minnesota. And either the egg or the recent hatchling was transported to Greece, New York, Rochester, New York, and fledged through what is referred to as a hacking process. In other words, you set up a nest site artificially. You allow that, you incubate the egg, you feed the hatchling, get it to fledge, and it gets released into the natural environment. So this bird, Amelia, was hatched out in Rochester, New York, and showed up in 1997 at the Travelers Tower in downtown Hartford. A floater male came along and paired up with her, and she has, for a period of 6 or 7 or 8 years, Amelia and her partner or partners have produced young. Now, the larger story is that we are grateful to falconers, those people who 100, 150 years ago were stealing eggs or young from nests and raising them for falconry activities, using predatory birds to hunt down prey and bring them back to the owner of the falcon. It is the falconers, in large part, who have been responsible for the restoration through captive breeding and release of captive birds into the eastern United States, paired with Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, and with birders who are desirous of having a species that's been locally extirpated returned to the eastern United States. Now, the one controversial aspect of this is that the peregrines that have been raised have come from different sources. Most of them are the tundra subspecies, tundrius, from the Arctic tundra. But there are some that are Peale's peregrine falcon from California area, and there are some that were used in these breeding programs that were from other parts of the world. Remember, there are 19 different subspecies of peregrine falcon. So there are some purists who say, we've got a mongrel peregrine here. You know, this is not a naturally occurring species. And my reaction to that is, have you seen one lately? Have you seen these birds fly and capture food and lay eggs and raise young and get restored to a situation that approaches or exceeds what we had 150 years ago? The second question that you had was, what's the carrying capacity for peregrine falcon? And as I've indicated toward the end of the talk, we now have 17 territorial pairs of peregrines in Connecticut. The most sites we had prior to 1950 was 5 sites in the entire state. So these birds were breeding on cliff tops. The 4 sites that I initially mentioned are all cliffs, trap rock ridges in the Central Valley lowlands. Peregrine falcons began breeding on bridges in the 1930s and 1940s and thereabouts. They bred on the Empire State Building, they bred on the St. Regis Hotel in New York City, and almost all of the pairs that are breeding in Connecticut today are breeding on human-made structures, bridges. The Q Bridge, for example, the Baldwin Bridge over the Connecticut River, the Gold Star Bridge over the Thames River, the NRG power plant in Devon, Milford, Connecticut. There's a tower that's 200 or more feet up in the air on Millstone Power Plant in Waterford. So these birds are breeding on human-made structures, and to a bird brain, that's a cliff. There are only 3 known sites in Connecticut today where they are breeding on natural ridges or quarries. And they are West Rock, East Rock, and a 3rd cliff site location in the lower Connecticut River. So they seem to have adapted to breeding on human structures very successfully. And probably the most successful site is the P.T. Barnum Bridge, Interstate 95, downtown Bridgeport, Connecticut. They've been cranking out young since 1999.
We have time for one more question.
Thanks. Yes, go ahead.
Well, Steve, when we have the chicks in the nest and being fed by the mother bird, have you observed favoritism in the way they're fed? So that I noticed with other species where there are multiple chicks in the nest. So the earlier hatchers will generally be fed more, become stronger, and will get the bulk of food, and the later ones will not make it. Have you observed anything like that?
The question is there favoritism expressed by the parents in feeding young? And the fact is that they do hatch somewhat asynchronously. In the case of peregrine falcons, they will tend to lay 3 eggs before they start serious incubation, although I've seen them incubating after 1 egg. The fact is they hatch out asynchronously as well, and those that hatch out earlier are going to be fed first, and over a period of days they may thrive, whereas the ones that hatch out later on are less successful. This is where the bad weather kicks in West Rock Ridge, because any vulnerability that the later individuals are facing as hatchlings, they're going to suffer the most. And I can't give you a good answer to that question based on my West Rock observations, because the fledgling success has been so limited. But I can tell you that there are a number of instances in recent years where as many as 4 or 5 young have successfully fledged under these protected bridge structures. So this is what we were talking about a little bit at dinner. Why don't these birds at West Rock just leave and find some better place to nest? And some of us are, in fact, have been rooting for that. But they don't leave. So from my own experience, I can't detect any favoritism on the part of the adults. It's just been so tough getting these eggs to hatch. They're either predated by owls, perhaps, or damaged by the weather, or are infertile to start with. So, thanks for asking that.
Thank you very much, Steve.